Welcome to the Bust and Jest channel. I'm Justin Best, and some of you may remember that about 2 years ago, I released a two-part video series called 50 Reasons to Never Quote Paul Again. And of course, ultimately, those videos ended up coming down for a while, but now I'm re-releasing the information that I have about Paul in a piece-by-piece methodology so that it's easier for people to sort of study through and digest. Of course, I promised that when I brought back these different points, I'd be adding more and more to it, and this is an example of that. And so I just wanted to, for today, address one concept, or one or two concepts really, which we'll dive into in just 1 second. If you're new to the channel, make sure you go ahead and hit the subscribe button below and click the bell so you can be notified each time I post. And if you're interested in these type of theological topics, then make sure you invite all of your favorite skeptical friends to come and journey along with us as we dive in. Today, I'll be screen sharing with you an article I recently published on bustandjust.com, and that article will be shown on screen and linked in the description box below for your review. So without further ado, let me just jump right in. And first of all, I wanted to introduce you to bustandjust.com. There's not really a whole lot on the site right here at the time, but if you want, you can come check out a little bit about me, go to my blog, and read my most recent post here. I'm going to be also posting additional articles to back up the other information that I've already posted on YouTube for further research purposes as well. All right, so let's just dive straight into it. And I'm basically going to read you my article and then maybe make some additional commentary here and there where I see that it might be appropriate. This is called Paul or Plato, the True Origins of New Testament Doctrine. Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? For many lifelong students of biblical literature and those raised in the Christian church, this famous quote from Acts 26:14 reminds us of a truly miraculous and inspirational event from the writings of the New Testament. In the famous story from Acts, Paul, who was truly named Saul from birth, is on the way to Damascus to imprison and stone to death the first century followers of Jesus Christ, who is by definition a demigod, born of a human mother despite his father being God Most High, more specifically. During his search, Paul is miraculously blinded by a great light and hears the voice of Jesus himself, who is quoted to have made a famous statement saying, "Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks." For many Christians, this is a beautiful and original story which retells Christ's conversion of Paul, a man who was relentless in his attacks against the disciples of Jesus. Paul was previously known to arrest and even kill Jesus' followers by stoning. For others, however, instead of being considered an example of divine interaction between a demigod and mankind, this passage is considered a blatant act of mimesis. In other words, it is an intentional copy of earlier established secular writings. And just to pause real quickly here, I went ahead and linked some of this stuff in here for you, so it's easy for you guys to come and click. If you want to learn more about mimesis and mimetic criticism, then you can dig in more and more just by clicking on the links embedded in the article here. Hopefully they'll help you to answer more of the questions that could come up from reading the article. Specifically, the theme of Acts 26 directly copies a then famous story of Dionysus from hundreds of years prior. In about 410 BCE, 464 years before or prior to Paul's ministry beginning, a well-known writer named Euripides composed a story-turned play called The Bacchae, which detailed the struggle between the demigod Dionysus and his primary adversary, King Pentheus. In fact, by 405 BCE, the Bacchae was so well received that it was first performed at the Theater of Dionysus in Athens, Greece. Here we have the Theater and Sanctuary of Dionysus, which was built 6th century BCE and was originally part of the Sanctuary of Dionysus Eleutherius, which means Dionysus the Liberator. And there it is. You can still go visit it today. It was in this famous play that Pentheus, king of Thebes, sought after the half-man, half-god named Dionysus, who's also called Bacchus. And he's seeking after him to have him arrested and stoned to death for his teachings and influence over the city of Thebes. So for those of you who are already familiar with the stories of Jesus from both the Gospels and Acts and Paul's writings, you might notice that what I do is I'll highlight some of the key motifs and themes in the actual literature so you can see sort of the interesting parallels that pop out to me when I'm reading through this stuff. Okay, sorry about that. I had to clear my throat a little bit. So King Pentheus is tracking down the followers of Dionysus to have them arrested. And in this story, he has Dionysus arrested, and he's seeking to have his followers stoned to death for their teachings and influence over the city of Thebes. So after Pentheus arrests Dionysus and has him cast into prison, which, by the way, Dionysus gives himself over willingly to Pentheus, a mighty earthquake sent by God causes Dionysus's chains to fall off while in prison, setting him free. According to the story, Dionysus chooses not to run, however, and soon therefore miraculously reveals himself to Pentheus once again. As Pentheus begins to try and threaten the demigod with more chains, Dionysus famously replies, "Better to yield him prayer and sacrifice than kick against the pricks, since Dionysus is a god and thou but mortal." Simply stated, this type of literary mimesis, this whole scenario is really an example of that type of mimesis, or the intentional copying of the motifs or themes of earlier secular writings, is found to be quite destructive to biblical or Bible literalists. In this one example alone, it becomes clear that Paul not only used the Bacchae's overall theme as a foundation for his own storytelling, but even quoted directly from Euripides, claiming instead that it was a statement of Jesus Christ. I'm certain that anyone with a fundamental understanding of these two separate literary occurrences will see that there are many uncanny parallels that are difficult to justify. So essentially, just to make it real simple, Paul was saying that what Christ said was a direct copy of what Dionysus said, very similar to what Dionysus said in a very similar situation, which makes it hard to read into this story as being literal. It makes it seem more like it's fictional, to be quite frank. Since we're on the subject, to understand just how similar Jesus Christ and Dionysus truly were, I invite you to view my 28-minute video study titled, "Jesus is Clearly an Archetype of Dionysus." It's actually called Jesus is Clearly Dionysus, but it's an archetype in parentheses. And so in that video, I go over in depth the reasons why I think it's pretty clear that Jesus and Dionysus are both archetypes, and they have a lot in common. I think that will definitely get you thinking. During the course of my research on the history and validity of the New Testament biblical texts, I ran into spheres of knowledge that I believe should give any hardcore Bible literalist pause. In fact, much of the evidence shown in this study is so well established by historians that many Bible commentaries have been forced to admit that these issues exist for a long time. But what about Paul himself? Does he imply that his inspiration comes from Greek and Roman philosophers or from God alone? Now, in the following passages from the New Testament, Paul writes, quote, "But I certify you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached of me is not after man. For I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ." That's Galatians 1:11-12. Then Paul says, quote, "Beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. For in him dwelleth all the fullness of the Godhead bodily." And that's from Colossians 2, verses 8 through 9. I made a little note here. Dionysus was also considered the one who revealed the Godhead bodily. If you watch that video about Dionysus and Jesus from earlier in this, you'll see the example that I'm talking about on the slides there. Next quote. Paul says, "Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this world? Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of this world?" And then that's from 1 Corinthians 1:20. And last, Paul says, "And I, brethren, when I came to you, came not with excellency of speech or wisdom, declaring unto you the testimony of God. For I determined not to know anything among you, save Jesus Christ, and him crucified." 1 Corinthians 2:1-2. From these statements of Paul's own writings, most students and scholars would accept that Paul is claiming to have been instructed in the wisdom and mysteries of Christ through direct revelation from God alone. Paul claims, "For I neither received it of man." Additionally, Paul states that the reader should be concerned that some would spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men. However, we'll soon demonstrate that Paul himself was clearly mimicking the philosophies and traditions of scholars before him. In the text from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul says that God has made foolish the wisdom of this world. Yet again, Paul himself continues to quote this worldly wisdom as a standard methodology throughout his works. Last, a full reading of 1 Corinthians chapter 2 paints a clear image to the reader that Paul's inspiration and spiritual wisdom comes from, quote, "the Spirit of God," and not the wisdom of men. Reading a bit further, verses 4-5 say, quote, "And my speech and my preaching was not with enticing words of man's wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith should not stand in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God." 1 Corinthians 2:4-5. In the context and study of the evidence below, I believe we can easily demonstrate Paul's mimetic connections and direct word-for-word copying of well-known prior philosophers. In fact, after a thorough review of the Hellenization of Jerusalem, again, please click these links, guys, and check this stuff out. It's really cool information. It's going to help you dive deep and understand my perspective on this if you want to. And a deep evaluation of earlier philosophical ideas, such as Stoicism and Platonism, one might become convinced that Paul based many or most of his doctrines on the wisdom of men and not from novel or new ideas given by the Spirit of God. Before I lay out 20 pieces of clear evidence for this hypothesis, it should be stated that there are at least a few primary issues associated with this conflict. So here's what I say are the major issues associated with this problem. I'm pointing this out as being an issue, and here's what I think are just a few of those issues. One, many of Paul's doctrines were not new or fundamentally groundbreaking, being copied from earlier Greek Stoics, Hellenistic influencers, and Platonic philosophers. Two, most Christians and New Testament readers assume that Paul's writings were inspired by God. Churches formed doctrines and even split denominations on the basis of the details and inspiration of Paul's writings. Three, Paul himself gives the impression that he was taught his doctrines by direct revelation from Jesus Christ himself and not from, quote, vain wisdom of men, as we read earlier. 4, Paul never physically met Jesus or studied under him for any period of time. And that's a pretty critical point, no matter what position you take. And 5, 13 of 27 of the New Testament books are actually attributed to Paul, making almost half of the New Testament open now to mimetic and figurative interpretation instead of a literal interpretation. Certainly, there are far more implications than only those listed above. These alone, however, demonstrate that whether or not Paul was truly inspired by God himself should be a very big deal to New Testament churches worldwide. It can't be overstated enough that churches everywhere throughout history are adamantly attempting to apply these Paulisms to their primary doctrines, truly believing that they were originally written by the hand of one of God's most important teachers by the power of the Holy Spirit. Now that some of the contextual and historical groundwork for this study has been laid, let's examine some of the evidence. We'll start with Paul's favorite inspiration, Plato, then move to Socrates, then Seneca the Younger, and finally, I'll end with a famous doctrine Paul borrowed from Aristotle himself. Remember, there is quite a bit of scholarly debate surrounding the timing of the New Testament writings. However, the earliest dating for Paul's writings, suggested by some scholars, it is mid-1st century CE. This, in many cases, is hundreds of years after the philosophers he mimics below. Paul copying Plato. So here's the first set of examples that I'm going to provide. And the first one is in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 24. Paul says, "Know ye not that they which run in a race run all, but one receiveth the prize?" But Plato said, "But such as are true racers, arriving at the end, both receive the prizes and are crowned." And he said that in the Republic by Plato, written in 375 BCE. Again, when you guys come to the site yourself, you can read through all these. I actually linked a lot of these clips and resources, so you can go dig into them further and read the entire context. I found the more that I've read of Plato, Socrates, and Seneca, especially Seneca, the more I see Paul's concepts just everywhere. These are just some of the ones that I've clipped and brought forward today. Number 2, in Romans chapter 7, verse 22 through 23, Paul says, "But I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind, and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin which is in my members." Plato says, quote, "There is a victory and defeat, the first and best of victories, the lowest and worst of defeats, which each man gains or sustains at the hands not of another, but of himself. This shows that there is a war against ourselves going on in every individual of us." This is from the Complete Works of Plato. Number 3, in Philippians 3:19, Paul says, "Whose end is destruction, whose God is in their belly, and whose glory is in their shame, who mind earthly things." In Plato, he gives a vivid description of these gluttonous and intemperate souls whose belly is their God in Plato's work called The Republic. Now, there's not like a really quick, easy snippet quote you can pull out and just show a mimesis of what Paul said here. But if you actually read the work, The Republic, you'll see that this is a theme in that book, that Plato talks about those who are ruled by their stomach and whose belly is their gods. In fact, here's a link to a University of Chicago paper called Gluttony and Philosophical Moderation. And it's a doctoral dissertation. And in this, if you want to dig in farther, you can see how he compares the idea of gluttonous and intemperate souls whose belly is their God being something that's from a theme from Plato. Number 4, in Romans 8:5 and Galatians 6:8, Paul says, "For they that are after the flesh do mind the things of the flesh." And in Galatians 6:8, Paul says, "For he that soweth to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption." Plato says to be carnally minded is death in Phaedo, which means on the soul. That's linked below too. You can go dig into Phaedo and read more about that as well. Number 5, in Philippians 1:21, Paul says, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." But Plato said, "Now if death is like this, then I say that to die is gain." Actually, if you read the whole context here, you can kind of see, you can't read everything, but it says, "Now I say if death is like this, I say that to die is gain. For eternity, then only a single night. But in death, if death is a journey to another place, and there, as men say, all the dead are, Yeah, so like I said, the more you start to read the actual context and more of the body of text surrounding, you start to see more and more interesting similarities. Number 6, in 2 Timothy 4:6, Paul says, I am now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand, to be with Christ, which is far better. This one's really interesting. In this one, Plato is quoting Socrates, and he says almost the very exact same thing. The hour of departure has arrived, and we go our ways, and I to die and you to live, which is better, only God knows. Again, very similar kind of structure and expression there. Number 7, it gets even better from here. It gets more and more, like this one's actually one of the most clear examples. In 1 Corinthians 13:12, Paul says, for now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. And Plato says, I am very far from admitting that he who contemplates existences through the medium of thought sees them only through a glass darkly, any more than he who sees them in their working effects. And there it is. That's in Phaedo by Plato. Again, several hundred years before Paul was around. So you can see how Paul was using these same expressions in his letters. Number 8, in 1 Thessalonians 5:15, Paul says, see that none render evil for evil unto any man. Plato says, then we ought not to retaliate or render evil for evil to anyone, whatever evil we may have suffered from him. So you just keep seeing this. It's all from Plato. So you can tell that Paul just read a lot of Plato and used a lot of Platonic ideas in all throughout his works. Number 9, in Ephesians 1:22-23, Paul says, quote, and hath put all things under his feet and gave him to be the head over all things to the church, which is his body, the fullness of him that filleth all in all, end quote. Plato says, first, then, the gods imitating the spherical shape of the universe enclosed 2 divine courses in a spherical body, that namely, which we now term the head, being the most divine part of us, and the Lord of all that is in us. To this the gods, when they put together the body, gave all the other members to be servants. So there you go. It's the same concept, that the body serves the head. And literally, we're talking about the parts of the body, and Paul is actually talking about parts of the body as well, which is the body and the head. So again, these are ideas that he got from Plato. He didn't get them from Jesus Christ in some dream vision. He got them from Plato. I'm just pointing this out right here. Number 10, in 1 Corinthians 9:16, Paul says, for necessity is laid upon me. Yea, woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel. This is crazy, guys. Plato says, but necessity was laid upon me. The word of God, I thought, ought to be considered first. That one's crazy. And it's like word for word, same structure, same sentence that Paul borrowed from Plato in this one, 1 Corinthians 9 right there. Let's get into a little bit more. This one's, Paul's now copying Socrates. Number 11. In 1 Corinthians 8:2, Paul says, and if any man think that he knoweth anything, he knoweth nothing, yet as he ought to know. And what Paul's doing here in this sentence is just expressing a very common ideology that was already circling, that Plato mentions Socrates talking about. Socrates said, quote, for my part, as I went away, I reasoned with regard to myself, I am wiser than this human being, for probably neither of us knows anything noble and good. But he supposes he knows something when he does not know, while I, just as I do not know, do not even suppose that I do. I am likely to be a little bit wiser than he is in this very thing, that whatever I do not know, I do not even suppose I know. So this is the very similar concept here. And if any man think that he knoweth anything, he knoweth nothing, yet as he ought to know. That's from, this is actually considered a well-known Socrates paradox, the Socratic paradox. Basically what Paul is spelling out is the Socratic paradox. All right, number 12. In Romans 12:4, Paul says, For as we have many members in one body, and all members have not the same office. Socrates says, to begin with, our several natures are not all alike but different. One man is naturally fitted for one task and another for another. Exactly. Same concept. Number 13. In 1 Corinthians 12, 14 through 17, Paul explains that, quote, a body is not one single organ, but many. Suppose the ear were to say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body. It does still belong to the body. If the body were all eye, how could it hear? If the body were all ear, how could it smell? But in fact, God appointed each limb and organ to its own place in the body as he chose. Socrates asks Protagoras, quote, is virtue a single whole? And are justice and self-control and holiness part of it? As the parts of the face are parts, mouth, nose, eyes, and ears. Socrates then probes into the metaphor further by asking Protagoras if they agree that each part serves a different purpose, just as the features of a face do, and the parts make the whole, but each serves a different purpose. The eye is not like the ear, nor has it the same function. Number 14, in 1 Corinthians 12:25, Paul says that there should be no schism in the body, but that the members should have the same care for one another, and whether one member suffer, all the members suffer with it, or one member be honored, all the members rejoice with it. Socrates says that the best governed city is one whose state is most like that of an individual man. For example, if the finger of one of us is wounded, the entire community of bodily connections stretching to the soul for integration with the dominant part is made aware, and all of it feels the pain as a whole. Again, Socrates, talking about the best governed city, acts like a body who feels pain together as a whole, as a group, right? And Paul is saying the same thing. He's talking about a form of government for the body of believers, or for the members of the Church of Christ. And he's comparing it in the same way. If one of us is wounded, we're all wounded. Again, this concept he learned from school, from Socrates, from his Hellenistic friends, from his studies in Greece. This is stuff that did not come from the Holy Spirit. It just simply came from what was circulating during his time. All right, now we're going to go into Paul copying Seneca the Younger. And this one's really interesting because Seneca was actually alive during some of the same times that Paul was alive, near the end of Seneca's life. So they were writing around the same times, depending on the disputes about when Paul started writing. There's no hardcore proof for dating when Paul started writing, and that's why there's so much debate circling around it. But even if you give the earliest time frame that Christians would like to say, they'd like to say that Paul started writing in 55, which is still 22 years after Christ would have died and supposedly ascended. Then you have Seneca doing much of his work before Paul started. So anyway, this is a really interesting study, Seneca the Younger. I invite you guys to dig into Seneca the Younger more, actually, because he was said to be a man who stood at the doors. He said, one of the philosophers said, Seneca the Younger stood at the doors of Christianity, but never walked through them, meaning he had a lot to do with setting up the initial Christian thinking that was circulating in the first century. So let's just jump right into it. This is Seneca the Younger. First, you should take notice that Acts 17:24 through 29 here below is broken into 5 parts, since the words of Paul in this section can be attributed to Seneca the Younger in at least 5 distinct ways. And again, these aren't necessarily words attributed to Paul, but these are stories about Paul's life that demonstrate the things Paul would have been saying about himself, possibly to Luke, who would have been one of the primary writers of Acts, more than likely. So what we're seeing is Paul's witness to his buddies, and they're recalling and recounting and writing what Paul's ministry supposedly was all about. So just this one section of Acts, which is Acts chapter 17, 24 through 29, mirrors Seneca the Younger in at least 5 ways. So we're breaking it out into 5 different verse sections. So this is example number 15. In Acts 17:24, Paul went on to say, God dwelleth not in the temples made with hands. Seneca, the most prominent contemporary representative of Stoicism, which I've talked about on this channel extensively, had put his doctrine into these words. The whole world is in the temple of the immortal gods, and temples are not to be built to God of stones piled on high. This sounds like 1 Peter also, by the way. He must be consecrated in the heart of every man. So again, this is something that Seneca was talking about just around the time and just before the time of Paul. In Acts 17:25, Paul said, Neither is God served by men's hands as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth himself to all life and breath and all things. Seneca put the same truth to this form, God wants not ministers, how so? He himself ministereth to the human race. So it's the same concept. God isn't served by human hands, he doesn't need anything from us. Instead, he gives us stuff. And Seneca was saying the same thing. He doesn't want ministers to him. He actually ministers to us. So again, this concept came from Seneca and not the Holy Spirit. Number 17, in Acts 17, verses 26 through 28, Paul said, God made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth. Seneca agrees. He says, we are members of a vast body. Nature made us kin, which means we're all family, when she produced us from the same things and to the same ends. Exactly, same exact concept. Very next verse. All these verses, boom, boom, right in a row, are all mirroring Seneca. Acts 17, 27 through 28. This is example number 18. Paul said, God is not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. But Seneca wrote, God is at hand everywhere and to all men. And again, God is near thee, he is with thee, he is within. Number 19, in Acts chapter 17, verse 29, it says, Then Paul proceeded, quote, Being then the offspring of God, we ought not to think the Godhead is like unto gold or silver or stone, graven by art or device of men, end quote. But in Seneca's The Epistles of Moral Life, he parallels this thought again. He says, quote, Thou shalt not form him of silver and gold. A true likeness of God cannot be molded of this material. And then for our last example, we have Paul copying Aristotle. Aristotle lived in 384 through 322 BCE. In Galatians 5:23 and Romans 2:14, Paul says, Against such there is no law. And in Romans 2:14, Paul says, they are a law unto themselves. This is big, actually, because in this context of this, Paul is saying that the Gentiles are a law unto themselves. That could cause a lot of crazy doctrines to come to a lot of conclusions. A lot of people, a lot of churches can come to a lot of conclusions and have through the years because of that statement right there in Romans 2:14. So, but in Aristotle's Politics, Book 3, Paul's words are eerily familiar to Aristotle's sayings of men eminent for wisdom and virtue. Against such there is no law, for they themselves are a law. And that came out of Aristotle's teachings hundreds of years before Paul ever quoted this. So there we have 20 examples, 21 actually, if you include the intro story about the road to Paul's road to Damascus story. But let me go ahead and just jump into the conclusion and finish up here. It says, it is at this point that I must remind the reader of the issues that I mentioned earlier. Namely that, number one, many of Paul's doctrines were not new or fundamentally groundbreaking, being copied from earlier Greek Stoics, Hellenistic influencers, and Platonic philosophers. 2, most Christians and New Testament readers assume that Paul's writings were inspired by God. Churches formed doctrine and even split denominations on the basis of the details and inspiration of Paul's writings. 3. Paul himself gives the impression that he was taught his doctrines by direct revelation from Jesus Christ himself and not the, quote, vain wisdom of men. 4. Paul never physically met Jesus or studied under him for any period of time. 5. 13 of 27 of the New Testament books are attributed to Paul, making almost half of the New Testament open to mimetic and figurative interpretation instead of a literal interpretation. In his writings, Paul claimed that he gleaned his powerful doctrines from a vision of Jesus Christ personally. However, it seems more likely he was influenced by the writers of his own period and the periods hundreds of years prior. Based on the fact that Paul himself admitted to being a Roman-born citizen and Pharisee who spent much of his time in Greece, he was a Hellenized Jew. Is it possible that he was simply formulating his own doctrine and stories of Jesus, since he directly copied Euripides, to grow his own cult following? Could he have based his writings on previously well-known and pre-existing Greco-Roman beliefs to make, quote, his gospel more palatable to the Gentiles that he claimed to be pursuing? In my hypothesis, the information contained in this study is additional proof that Paul's character and writings were designed to help the Greek-minded Jews develop Christianity in its early forms with familiar tales of a stoic Jesus with philosophical ideas that would have made the Greek philosophers into partial prophets led by the Spirit of God. To better understand this hypothesis, a deep understanding of Christianity and its Hellenistic philosophy must be held in view. In conclusion, it is my belief that Paul was simply doing what many philosopher wannabes did during that time. Developing his own Greco-Roman doctrines, Paul traveled around preaching his ideas and writing letters to establish his own following. Paul was seeking to become a, quote, influencer of his own time, a very common endeavor of that period. These practices were widespread during this period, and so was the copying of other people's work. If God had a new message to give Paul and his Gentile/Greek followers, why didn't God give Paul new ideas instead of God and Paul copying Plato? Personally, Paul's mimesis combined with the contextual evidence of fiery first-century philosophical competition makes the meaning behind Paul calling his work my gospel even more clear. Just some food for thought. All right, so what I mean to say at the very end there is that I believe that Paul was part of a fierce competition that was sort of happening in the first century. Everyone was competing. A lot of different philosophers were competing for clout. They were trying to make their name, put their name out there, put their stories out there, put their version of a gospel, their version of a philosophical or ideological belief system out into the world. And this was just Paul's version of it. And I think, I can't remember how many times he says it. It's a ton, but he says my gospel over and over and over and over through his writing. So anyway, that's just a little piece of my perspective on Paul. Just 21 more examples of why I don't think that Paul should be someone that anyone bases their life decisions off of. I don't think any church should form any doctrine off of the things that Paul says. And personally, I don't think the New Testament is inspired by anyone other than a bunch of different writers of their times. And we're going to continue going through each one, and I'll continue explaining why I believe that's the case for the different books. But guys, if you enjoyed this content and you want to see more, then make sure you do me a favor and hit the subscribe button. And like I said before, hit the bell icon so you can be notified when I post. I have a long list of additional topics coming up that I'd love to share with you. Actually, let me go ahead and pull up real quick before I get off of here. I'll leak to you some of the titles. I have a study coming up called Mark or Homer, and it's going to be a mimetic connection overview, proving, in my opinion, that Mark is a very strong mimetic connection to Homer's works in a very chronological way too. That's kind of freaky. I got another one I want to talk about, being Jesus is Titus. I know I did Jesus is Dionysus. I want to also do Jesus is Titus and show that mimetic criticism also creates big problems for the stories about Jesus in that way as well. Also, I have one called Moses is an archetype. 50 reasons the New Testament is fiction. 50 reasons to never quote Paul again. Of course, we're working on that right now. No Jesus prophecy exists in the Old Testament. And man, I just got more and more. Too Dumb for Paul Reloaded. Is God a narcissist? The Old Testament stolen from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and on and on. I got a lot of topics I want to cover and a lot of really interesting information. So stick around and check it out. Keep your mind open to all the different information. You know, I'm just here to try and find the truth, and that's really all I want. So anyway, thanks for sticking around with me this long. I appreciate your support. Go ahead and do me a favor and give the video a like, and we will be in touch very soon with a whole lot more. Peace out.